Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video, which today is going to be tackling another favourite topic of moon landing deniers, the Apollo 11 post-flight press conference. I constantly see memes and video clips showing the three astronauts during their press conference and people saying how they don't look particularly excited or they look very glum and suspicious considering they've supposedly just gone down in history as the first people to walk on the moon. Now, this tends to get interpreted in one of two ways. Some people claiming it's evidence that they never went to the moon at all. Others claiming that they did go to the moon, but they witnessed something so horrific and traumatizing, and they just couldn't talk about it.
So like you're saying in that press conference, right? They don't look like national heroes coming back from having been the first men on the moon.
Like hostages.
They look like they've had the shit scared out of them, or, yeah. So I think that these people saw some terrifying things up there, and that's also what Soviet intelligence thought.
Now, of course, those two ideas contradict themselves, but one thing of note about the conspiracy arguments with this is that people seem to only look at cherry-picked sections of the press conference. Like they'll post a screenshot or a video clip of only a few seconds taken from a press conference that was almost 90 minutes long. Yet, if you watch the full press conference, there are many occasions where they're laughing, smiling, and cracking jokes.
This was the first of a number of times when we found two men were a great help. I quickly put up the TV camera.
Was there ever a moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
Sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point.
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We'd been orbiting around the moon for quite a while.
In simulations, we have a large number of failures, and we're usually spring-loaded to the abort position. In this case, in the real flight, we're spring-loaded to the land position.
And secondly, I think this question was asked, but I didn't get the complete answer. How do you propose to restore some normalcy to your private lives in the years ahead?
I wish I knew the answer to the latter part of your question.
Kind of depends on you.
Based on your own experience in space, do you or any of you feel that there will ever be an opportunity for a woman to become an astronaut in our space program?
Gosh, I hope so.
And you can see the cherry picking by the fact that there are multiple copies of the full press conference on YouTube, and the ones where they show the trend marker over the timeline all have a giant spike in attention over the same point.
Moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon.
What the exact...
Able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon.
This is even singled out on podcasts by the likes of Bart Sibrel.
And when a reporter asked Neil Armstrong about what was the stars like, was that incredibly beautiful? He says, I don't remember. And then Michael Collins, who wasn't supposed to have been walking on the moon with him, right? He was supposed to be orbiting while they walked. He says, to help him out, I don't remember seeing any.
How could Michael Collins say he didn't see stars when he wasn't on the moon? Simple answer is because the question was not actually asking about seeing stars whilst they were on the moon. The question came from astronomer Sir Patrick Moore, who asked about seeing stars in the solar corona.
I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may. When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
The solar corona is the outermost part of the sun's atmosphere, and it's not normally visible to us apart from when there's a total eclipse. With the moon blocking the sun, the corona then becomes visible. Now, the press conference was in two parts. The first part involved the astronauts detailing the mission along with accompanying photos and videos, followed by a Q&A from the journalists. And towards the end of the astronaut section going over the photos and videos, they talked about how on the coast between the Earth and the moon actually eclipsed the sun.
During our flight to the moon, we flew through the moon's shadow. In fact, the moon was eclipsing the sun, and we took the opportunity to try to take some photographs of it, but our film was just not sufficiently fast to capture the event. However, this does show the brightest part of the solar corona. It extends several moon diameters in addition on each side, roughly parallel to that light.
So they tried to photograph this eclipse, but the film speed was too slow because it had all been selected based on them photographing out in broad daylight, so no stars showed up in the photograph. And so Sir Patrick Moore, being an astronomer, was interested to know if they actually saw stars in the corona, because it was the first time that an eclipse had been viewed whilst a far distance from the Earth. Michael Collins was present for that event, so him answering that he doesn't recall seeing any makes perfect sense. But on the topic of cherry-picking screenshots, there are posts like these, for example, basically saying, look how happy the astronauts were before they flew versus when they got back, and that the top photo is more what people expect they should have been acting like having just got back from the moon. And hilariously, that is exactly how happy they were when they got back from the moon, because this top shot is a photo from just after they returned, not before they left. So let's get some context of what the astronauts actually went through, because there are a few factors to consider with this press conference. Firstly, I think some people are under the impression that this press conference was done as soon as they got back, and so they should be filled with emotions. But it wasn't. Apollo 11 splashed down back on Earth on the 24th of July 1969. The press conference was held on August 12th. That's because NASA's procedure for the first few moon landings were that crews would have a 21-day isolation period, because having not returned samples from the moon before, they couldn't guarantee there was no infectious lunar pathogens that might be brought back. They knew the chances were very slim, but they were not prepared to take any risks. So, after splashdown, before even exiting the command module, the astronauts put on hazmat suits. They were then recovered into a helicopter, which transferred them back to the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, where they went from the helicopter straight into a mobile quarantine facility, then spoke directly to President Nixon, who was on board waiting to welcome them back.
Well, I can only summarize it because I don't want to hold you now. You have so much more to do, and gee, you look great. You feel as good as you look? Feel great.
Feel just perfect, Mr. President.
Yeah. I understand Frank Borman says you're a little younger by reason of having going into space. Is that right? Do you feel that way, a little younger?
We're a lot younger than Frank Borman's.
That is when this photo was taken, with them all looking happy, right after they got back from the moon. They stayed in that mobile quarantine facility for the next few days as the USS Hornet sailed from the recovery location to Pearl Harbor. The quarantine unit was then offloaded onto a trailer with the astronauts still on board, driven to Hickman Air Force Base, where it was loaded onto a cargo plane that flew them to Houston, where they were then transferred to the Lunar Receiving Lab along with all the rock samples and the command module itself. The astronauts' wives were actually there to see them, but the astronauts remained in quarantine, being transferred to a separate crew quarters where they then remained for the next 2 weeks, finally being allowed out on the 10th of August 1969. August 11th, they were allowed to spend with their families resting, and then the press conference was the following day, 19 days after they returned to Earth. And in case someone's thinking, hold on, 19 days? I thought you said it was a 21-day isolation period. The isolation period started once Neil and Buzz returned to the command module in lunar orbit, given at that point all three of them were then technically isolating. So the astronauts did have a euphoria about them when they first returned to Earth, but this press conference was 3 weeks later. And that 3 weeks in between was not only spent with them in isolation, but they were also kept very busy, as Armstrong himself alluded to in the press conference.
In the lunar receiving laboratory, we did have very little time for meditation, it turns out. We were quite busy throughout the time period with the same sorts of things that the crews of past flights have done after their flights.
After each mission, the crews did technical debriefs for engineers to learn and improve on procedures, as well as for the next mission's crew to benefit from. For example, 2 months prior to Apollo 11, Apollo 10 conducted essentially a full dress rehearsal flight for the first landing. They flew all the way to lunar orbit and took the lunar module to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface, which is where Apollo 11's powered descent would begin. After they returned home, the crew of Apollo 10 not only did a 3-hour debrief detailing the issues that they found as well as recommendations for improvement, but they also then sat down with the crew of the upcoming Apollo 11 flight to discuss everything with them. And the crew of Apollo 11 did technical debriefs as well, although their recordings totaled about 6 hours, all of which was done whilst they were in quarantine. So by the time they'd come around to this press conference, not only had they been back on Earth for 3 weeks, they'd been stuck in isolation and seemingly spent most of the time working. Then there are factors that people are trying to read into their body language. But everyone is different in how they handle different situations. These three are sitting in front of a crowded room of journalists and cameras, essentially with the eyes of the world upon them, which some people would find a bit nerve-wracking and intimidating. So, in order to get a truer sense, you need to compare how someone typically behaves. Much like with a polygraph test, you can't just immediately start interrogating a person because the polygraph has no baseline to measure against. So you have to ask a person control questions to see how they normally respond when telling the truth, and then compare that to how they respond to other questions. And people will highlight that during the press conference, the astronauts look almost bored at times or fidgeting a lot. Now, if we look at their pre-flight press conference, we see they actually behave quite similarly. Of course, some could argue that that's because they haven't been to the moon yet, or some might say that they're behaving like this because they know they aren't actually going to the moon. But these were not their first trips to space either. Buzz had flown on Gemini 12, Collins on Gemini 10, and Armstrong on Gemini 8. Now, unfortunately, finding archive footage of most press conferences is not easy these days. All bar the most notable missions, it's hard to come by. But I found some photos from the post-flight press conferences of Geminis 10 and 12, and in none of the photos do Aldrin or Collins look particularly joyful, despite both having just done spacewalks. Armstrong's Gemini press conference, though, is much easier to find because Gemini 8 turned out to be very eventful. They almost had a fatal situation where one of the thrusters on board the spacecraft jammed open and put them into an incredibly fast spin, reaching some 296 degrees per second. That's close to 1 full rotation each second. Much more than that, and the crew were at risk of blacking out and not making it home alive, were it not for the fact that Armstrong was able to work through the problem, shut off the orbit maneuvering system, and use the re-entry thrusters to stop the roll. Dave Scott, who was the other astronaut on board Gemini with Armstrong, even said afterwards, quote, The guy was brilliant. He knew the system so well, he found the solution, he activated the solution under extreme circumstances. It was my lucky day to be flying with him, end quote. This coolness under pressure is one of the reasons NASA put Armstrong in command of the first lunar landing mission. And yet, if you watch the post-flight press conference of Gemini 8, with an arguably much smaller audience than the one for Apollo 11, Armstrong still looks nervous. He's constantly fiddling with pens and touching his neck and so on. But those people who knew Armstrong often described him as quiet and reserved, not liking the fame. Even during the Gemini 8 press conference, one of the journalists mentioned that Armstrong, who was piloting the craft, managed to land closer to the splashdown target than any of the preceding missions.
Neil, I understand you and Dave also chalked up another honor in Gemini 8 in addition to the world's first docking, which was you landed closer to the splash point than any other spacecraft ever has. Can you tell us about that?
And Armstrong wouldn't take credit for it.
Well, I think that it's a tribute to the equipment. We were actually depending on the spacecraft computer inertial guidance platform combination to give us that information and navigate to the proper place out on the ocean, and it was just really a matter of following its commands once we identified that it was operating correctly.
And that seems very much his mentality, listening to him talk about Apollo 11 as well. He seems reluctant to take credit for being the first on the moon when he was just one person in amongst a much larger team that had been working for years to get them there.
To identify the features as they came up so that we would be able to pinpoint just where in the landing ellipse the computer was taking us.
I suppose was carrying on a rapid-fire conversation with the computer at that point, but I think we really have to give the credit to the control center in this case. They were the people that really came through and helped us and said, continue, which is what we wanted to hear.
And this, for me, is where we start to show the confirmation bias of conspiracy theorists and them cherry-picking parts of a press conference. The press conference for Apollo 11 was almost an hour and a half long. They'd spent 45 minutes recapping the mission and then 45 minutes being asked questions. And if you watch the entire press conference, you see for the most part, they're relaxed with their answers. Sure, they're not dancing around on tables with delight. Their responses are considered and measured and professional, but they're often cracking jokes and smiling. For the most part, the questions are directed by the journalists to particular individuals, and when those questions are about events during the mission, they have no hesitation in answering them. However, the propaganda posts, which people seem to love to reference, like to focus on this part which came later in the press conference.
Many of us and many other people in many places have speculated on the meaning of this first landing on another body in space. Would each of you give us your estimate of what is the meaning of this to all of us?
Now, this is after about 30 minutes of them answering questions. The question isn't directed at anyone in particular and is rather a philosophical question that has just been sprung on them out of nowhere. Of the entire 40 minutes of them being asked questions, this question and the solar corona one seem to be the ones that people like to focus on and seemingly ignore the rest. And this is where I think their whole arguments fall apart. Because they say the moon landings were fake because the Apollo 11 crew seemed bored or unsettled in the press conference. Even though, for the most part, they're smiling and often joking. They were even asked at one point about a moment in the flight where Houston was reporting hearing whistling.
2 questions. Where did the weird sounds, including the sirens and whistles, come from during the trans-Earth coast? I believe ground control had asked for an explanation, saying it had come from the spacecraft.
And Armstrong starts grinning, before then admitting they were pranking them with a tape recorder.
We're guilty again. We sent the whistles and bells. We had a little tape recorder, which we used to record our comments during the flight. In addition, play music in the lonely hours. And we thought we'd share that with the people in the control center.
People just seem to focus on the odd little bits rather than looking at the press conference as a whole. As a whole, it's a pretty normal press conference. There's probably added pressure from the fact that everyone's watching them, but their behaviour is generally in line with how they've acted in previous press conferences. Which means, if them being measured in responses means to some people that it must be faked, then surely those people must then think, if the astronauts were more upbeat in the press conference, then that would mean it wasn't fake. Except Apollo 11 was the first but not the only mission to try and land on the moon. Apollo 12 followed only a few months later. And now, whilst I could not find the entire press conference, I was able to find 2 short clips of Pete Conrad and Al Bean, who were the 2 that walked on the moon, and their body language seems much more open and upbeat.
The one thought I had about the moon that sticks in my mind is almost everything in the universe that we know of or think about seems to have some utilitarian function. And we were up there circling the moon, and I kept wondering what the function of the moon was. It didn't appear to have any capability to support life as we know it. It didn't appear to be doing a lot for the Earth. We could probably live without the tides. Things would change, the balance would change. And the only thing I can think about is perhaps that thing has been set up there to provide like the scientists have said a little bit, provide a storehouse of knowledge to find out how our Earth began and where it came from and what it looked like 4.6 billion years ago or 100 million years ago, which has been lost forever on the Earth. And I don't have the answer to that, but it was one of the things I wondered about as I circled and looked down at it.
And then the following mission was Apollo 13, which, had that gone to plan, I probably would not be able to find their press conference either. However, Apollo 13 famously went spectacularly wrong when an oxygen tank exploded 3/4 of the way to the moon. The landing was scrubbed, and there was even concerns about whether or not the crew would make it home alive. Now, because their mission didn't land on the moon, they didn't need to quarantine like Apollo's 11 and 12 crews had done. They splashed down on April 17th. They were picked up by the USS Iwo Jima. The following day, they flew to nearby Samoa before then being flown to Hawaii, where they met President Nixon and were reunited with their families. They eventually made it back to Houston late on April 20th and had their press conference on April 21st. They didn't even get around to doing their technical debriefs until 3 days after this, and their press conference mood was much more upbeat.
So I armed the A system and I could hear the relays, and nothing happened, and I armed the B system and nothing happened, so I kind of felt we were home free.
Meanwhile, I'm back in the lab with an open tunnel hoping that nothing happens. Fred and Jack were powering up the command module, and even though it maybe wasn't noticeable to me, it looked like it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I kept yelling back to Jack, "How are you coming? Are you doing fine? When can I leave Aquarius?"
He was a little bit nervous when he kept asking. He kept saying, "Jack, how you coming? The Earth is getting bigger."
So for anyone who's arguing that Apollo 11 couldn't have gone to the moon because their press conference was too somber, then that must also mean that the better moods of Apollos 12 and 13 is evidence that they did travel to the moon. But then, of course, people are only focusing on this one press conference, which came right after what was essentially 4 weeks of isolation and then half an hour of being constantly bombarded by questions from reporters. The day after the press conference, they were driven through the streets of New York, waving at crowds of people. A few weeks later, they were on their worldwide goodwill tour, spending a month and a half visiting 24 different countries, including Turkey, Australia, and the UK, even visiting the royal family, and they don't look unhappy here. But I suspect most conspiracy theorists won't see it that way. Much like when they bring up Bart Sibrel challenging astronauts to swear on the Bible. And people make a big deal that several of them wouldn't swear on the Bible, and they argue that because they wouldn't do it, it means they never went. But they won't accept the astronauts who did swear on the Bible. You can't have it both ways. If refusing to swear on the Bible means you're lying about it, then it must also be taken that agreeing to swear on the Bible is you being truthful. And I've experienced this personally. Just a few weeks ago, I had a flat earther challenging myself and Jerin Campanella about whether or not we went to Antarctica last December. And they asked if we would swear on our family's lives that we did.
Would you swear? Can you swear now that you were there? I just want to,
I swear I was
hear
there.
You say that.
Yeah. I was there.
So say it.
I
say
swear I was
you
in
were there.
Antarctica December 14th
Okay, he
through
says it.
17th.
Why don't you say it?
Now, Jerin did it without hesitation. But I decided to play them at their own game because I know the conspiracy mindset. They were never going to just accept that we'd gone if we swore that we went. But instead, they would twist it to say they lied about going and they've dismissed their own family's lives to cover for it. You can't trust them. So I countered their challenge by saying I'd be happy to do it, but only if he swore that he'd accept my response. If I turn around and say, yeah, I swear that I was there in Antarctica, are you going to go, okay, I accept you're in Antarctica?
Well,
No.
so in other words, after your long answer, you still cannot swear that you were in Antarctica.
Shock horror, he wouldn't do it. And he did take it as suspicious that I hesitated, but then he wouldn't accept that Jerin swearing without hesitation meant he went either. And it seems exactly the same when it comes to the moon landings as well. People will take one particular type of behaviour as evidence that they didn't go, but they won't take the opposite behaviour from somebody else as proof that they did go. It's basically heads they win, tails you lose. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.